Hi guys. I wanted to talk about the idea of science as we experience it versus science how God experiences it. That is, it's an interesting question to ask. What does God think about science? How would he contextualize it? Now, obviously, we can't know because in the infinite knowledge of God, every possible contextualization probably occurs. But nonetheless, as an expression, I think what we can do just by asking the question is start to see science as something in the world, a phenomenon within it, and not ultimately the fount of all explanatory power, which it isn't, and really should not have ever been, but has become for various serious reasons that have to do with, interestingly, both how individuals develop in consciousness since the dawn of time, and also how culture as a whole is developing in consciousness. And of course, there's a parallel there. So, what is science? Science is, at its heart, many things. I mean, that's the first place to start, is the idea that science is a strict definition, is kind of a game of scientists. It's not really the case. I think we want to say about science something very particular, which is that science essentially comes up with, at its broadest, comes up with models of reality in which they then validate the model through statistical demonstration of predictive power. I mean, that's for anything, whether you want to call sociology a science or psychology a science or anything that even dares to call itself a science, at its heart is a articulation that we can predict the future because of a model we have. And then, of course, this is a basic template, grows and grows and grows and becomes, the edifice of modern thought, you know what I mean, and contemporary thinking about reality, metaphysics, everything else, because we have a model that just keeps getting more and more accurate in a kind of precise mechanical way. And every time this happens, we see it as a validation that, yes, this has been the right way to approach reality all along, because we keep getting better at it. But what's being exposed finally is something that I think anyone who's ever believed in God can really know, which is that this process of finding more and more predictive, isolated, mechanical explanations for the world, in the most detailed sense, physics, which is the most rigorous in terms of actually making precise predictions. By doing that, it just keeps opening more and more doors about how to explain what's going on. The reality is that there's infinite explanation, that the causal order will never be completely explained, because to do so it'd be over, it'd be determined. And the fundamental indeterminacy of reality that just is, even within God, who can relate to himself as fully determined because of he understands the necessary indeterminacy totally. But in being and in contingent existence, this necessary indeterminacy means that the explanation systems will just get more and more and more and more mechanically elaborate, or even conceptually elaborate if we let it. I mean, this is obviously what's the case. I'm sure there's a way to make sense of the universe physically as nothing but right triangles. If you wanted to if you had the cognitive power and spend the time doing it, you could take physical data from the CERN and then turn it into a theory about how right triangles create reality, or circles, or dodecahedrons. And I'm interested in all these kind of geometric speculations. But the point is clear, is that it's the explanation of reality is intrinsically infinite. And our ability to use science to actually make causal predictions about things that actually matter to us, in terms of the actual outcomes of things like world events, the economy, all these things should be equally under the auspices of rigorous predictive science, and they're not. Because the higher level consciousness, the more the indeterminacy creates new spheres of explanation, conceptualization, understanding that cannot be reduced to the mechanical level below. The behavior of economics would not be helped if we knew every particle in the universe and where it was going. I mean, maybe it helps a bit, but like, because ultimately they form wholes that are unpredictable. The indeterminacy moves a different direction. So how might God relate to what we're doing then as a people and as a culture and as a set of consciousnesses with science? Well, on one extreme end, I think it's really like him looking at Mario and Luigi in the Super Mario Brothers, and instead of going to save the princess, Mario and Luigi stay on stage 1-1 with the blue sky and the clouds, just wondering how a mushroom can get into a block. And they sit there, and instead of going to save the princess, they spend all their time explaining the mechanisms of the mushroom and the block and the question mark. But this is totally ludicrous. The point of reality is to engage with it and not worry about explaining necessarily how the scenery got there, or what holographic model, quantum model, prime matter model you want to explain the scenery. It's not about the scenery. Scenery can be beautiful. I mean, aesthetically, it's quite about the scenery. But it's really about saving the princess and playing the game. And contemporary secular culture and scientific culture doesn't believe that there is a game to play. And so the game is ultimately just explain the world through mechanical causes, because that's been very helpful for us in order to control it materially. And so if we keep doing that, eventually we'll control it, and it'll be totally under our control, which is what we want. We want science to give us control of reality. I mean, ultimately, I mean, it's not a bad impulse, and it's beautiful what science has done and the way science has made our lives modern and comfortable. But science gets almost too much credit here. And the engineers who actually do the trial and error processes that are much more mysterious, that give us the actual comforts and organizations of the world, the way it's actually organized materially, that happens as a much more stochastic process. That is not as strictly just an empirical study. And most of the breakthroughs in science, when they really were making a big difference for the entire world, and making a really big difference just over how basic things were done, were much more like conceptual philosophical breakthroughs. I mean, the theory of gravity, you know, calculus had to be invented at one end, so that was a major conceptual breakthrough. And yes, there was an empirical dimension to looking at the world and finding the value of gravity. But it wasn't like a bunch of trial and error statistical analysis of a double blind. You know, once you had the basic conceptual system, then the rest was just pumped into it, and with a little room for empirical to fill in a variable, not to make statements about the world from some sort of statistical analysis of it alone. Mostly it was conceptual. Mostly it was mathematical. Mostly it was purely objective understanding in the highest possible conceptual strata. And those have been the science breakthroughs. Look at all the stuff that led to the invention of the computer and Turing's work and the Turing machine as a concept, which is purely abstract. I mean, all these things that actually really make a difference are almost not like what we call science. They're much more almost like what we call math or philosophy, but applied in a scientific context and in a metaphysical context, which allows it to look like science, because it presupposes the material world on some level, which is not a bad thing. I'm not against that, but it just, as an overarching view of reality, that is not helpful to the human spirit, to reality. It's just not the case. So we need to stop being Mario and Luigi. We've really kind of maxed out our ability to control material reality. No one wants to talk about this. Peter Thiel does a little bit. Even though our technology seems like it's exploding on one level, it's all on the ephemeral digital level. In terms of our material control, it's basically done. I mean, we're not going to get cars much faster. Spaceships are a fantasy of a material vision of reality, which doesn't even really make sense, other than as a storytelling device. no, the time has come for us to return to playing the game and to realizing that there is a sense in which science was a big distraction because it was based on a neurotic fixation with making something real in the world as a whole, as opposed to just letting it be the aesthetic um, the aesthetic amphitheater of the dramas, which is all it needs, all it really is. But there's reasons we don't believe that. I'll talk about that later. But I just wanted to mention that and have you think about that and think about, what science is, how it's perceived, and what it should be. And again, I love science, but I also fear it because its background assumptions can be very, very corrupt. Okay, thank you.